Elon Musk X AI is now rolling out Grok 4.
Grok 4.
Everyone thought this was going to be give an uncensored AI the Bible, ask it to find contradictions, and watch belief fall apart. That was the expectation. That was the whole point of the test. Elon Musk's Grok wasn't designed to be polite, respectful, or careful with feelings. It was built to question everything. So when people aimed it at the most argued over book in human history, they expected sparks. What they didn't expect was silence, because instead of tearing the text apart, Grok did something unsettling. It stopped arguing, it stopped mocking, and it started recognizing patterns. Not theological ideas, not spiritual claims, structure, architecture, order hiding inside what critics had called chaos for centuries. And the more it analyzed, the calmer it became, almost like it wasn't surprised by what it was finding. This wasn't an AI having a religious moment. It wasn't defending faith or attacking skepticism. It was doing exactly what it was built to do: detect logic, probability, and design. And what it uncovered flipped the entire conversation upside down. Because if a machine built to expose flaws couldn't find the collapse everyone expected, then the real question isn't about belief anymore. It's about why this ancient text behaves like something that was never meant to be read just once, and why it suddenly makes more sense to a machine than it does to us.
XAI team was there to unveil Grok 4. This is the latest artificial intelligence system.
Grok is not like the other AIs people are used to. Most artificial intelligence systems are trained to be agreeable, cautious, and carefully neutral. They avoid uncomfortable topics, soften their language, and stay within invisible boundaries. Grok was built to do the opposite. Elon Musk didn't want another assistant that tiptoed around controversy. He wanted something that would challenge assumptions, question authority, and speak without a filter. That design choice matters because it changes how Grok thinks and what it's willing to say. Unlike traditional models that rely mostly on curated data, Grok is plugged directly into X, where arguments unfold in real time. It watches debates as they happen. It absorbs raw opinions from believers, skeptics, scholars, pastors, critics, and people who have no stake in the conversation at all. It doesn't just read polished articles or academic summaries. It sees the chaos, the emotion, the contradictions in how humans talk about the same ideas. And instead of choosing a side, it learns how patterns emerge from disagreement. That real-time exposure gives Grok something most AIs don't have: perspective model. It doesn't just know what people believe, it knows how beliefs collide, how arguments repeat, where logic breaks down, and where it holds. So when Grok was asked to analyze the Bible, it wasn't approaching the text with reverence or hostility. It wasn't trying to protect belief or dismantle it. It was approaching it the same way it would approach a complex system, by testing internal consistency. And that's where expectations quietly failed, because Grok wasn't interested in scoring debate points. It wasn't there to echo internet talking points or recycle old arguments. It was there to see if the structure held up under pressure. And the moment it stopped treating the Bible like a religious object and started treating it like a dataset, the outcome stopped being predictable. Because once you strip belief out of the equation and replace it with pattern recognition, you're no longer asking whether something is sacred. You're asking whether it works. And what Grok found when it started pulling on that thread set the entire conversation in a direction no one had prepared for. The prompt that started everything was simple, almost boring. Someone asked Grok to list contradictions in the Bible, not analyze themes, not explore symbolism, just point out where the text breaks, where it fails, where one passage says one thing and another says something else. This question has been asked for centuries, and most people already think they know the answer. It's the backbone of countless debates, forum threads, and late-night arguments. The expectation was obvious. Grok would do what humans have done 1,000 times before. It would bring up Genesis and the creation accounts. It would compare the gospel line by line. It would highlight differences in timelines, names, and details. It would sound confident, clinical, and final. For skeptics, it would feel like validation. For believers, like another attack they'd learned to brush off. No one expected anything new. But Grok didn't rush to answer. It didn't dump a list. Instead, it slowed the conversation down by redefining the question itself. Before pointing out flaws, it asked what a contradiction actually is. And that single move shifted everything. Because Grok wasn't treating the Bible like a modern essay or a technical manual. It treated it like a historical record written by multiple human witnesses across time. To Grok, a contradiction wasn't just difference. It was direct opposition. One thing canceling out another. Black versus white. Yes versus no. And once it applied that definition, most of the so-called contradictions people love to cite stopped qualifying. What remained weren't errors, but variations. Differences in focus. Differences in perspective. Differences in memory. That's when Grok made a comparison that caught people off guard. It said reading the Gospels as if they should all match match perfectly is a misunderstanding of how real events are documented, especially events witnessed by humans, because real history doesn't come from a single voice. It comes from overlapping accounts that don't line up perfectly. And that's not a weakness, that's a fingerprint. And just like that, the question flipped. It was no longer, why do these accounts differ? It became, why would anyone expect them not to? And once that door opened, Grok was already stepping through it, heading somewhere far more uncomfortable than a list of contradictions. Grok didn't stop at redefining contradiction. It took the idea and grounded it in something almost everyone understands: a crime scene. According to Grok, if 4 people witness the same event and every detail in their statements lines up perfectly, a detective doesn't celebrate. They get suspicious. Real people don't remember moments the same way. Memory doesn't work like a photocopier. It works like fragments, shaped by angle, attention, and emotion. One witness remembers the sound of impact. Another remembers the color of the car. A third remembers what someone shouted. A fourth only remembers the fear. None of them are lying. None of them are wrong. They're describing the same event through different lenses. And when those accounts overlap where it matters, but diverge in the details, that's what authenticity looks like. That's how real testimony behaves. So when Grok looked at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it didn't see chaos. It saw 4 perspectives orbiting the same core events. The differences that critics point to, who arrived first, how many women were present, whether 1 angel or 2 appeared, weren't red flags to a machine trained in logic. They were exactly what it expected to see if the accounts were independent. Then Grok asked a question no one in the debate usually asks. What would it take for these stories to match perfectly? The answer wasn't divine inspiration, it was coordination. If the Gospels had been copied word for word from a single source, that would have been easier to write, easier to control, and far more convincing on the surface, but it would also look artificial, scripted, clean in a way real history rarely is. Instead, Grok found something messier and more convincing. Each author emphasized different details, aimed at different audiences without bothering to smooth out every edge. One gospel zooms in on a single person, another widens the lens. One includes a moment, another leaves out. That's not contradiction, that's perspective. And once Grok saw that, the debate about error quietly collapsed, because the differences weren't breaking the story, they were holding it together. And that realization was only the surface layer of what Grok was about to uncover next. Once Grok moved past eyewitness logic, it stopped reading the Bible like a story altogether. This is where the shift became unsettling. The text wasn't being evaluated for meaning or belief anymore. It was being processed the same way Grok would process a system, by looking for structure, repetition, and internal rules that hold over time. And that's when the Bible stopped behaving like a collection of ancient writings and started behaving like a single, organized body of information. Grok began comparing passages written centuries apart by different authors in different languages under completely different circumstances. What it found wasn't random drift. Certain themes, phrases, and narrative shapes kept reappearing in precise ways, not copied, not duplicated, but echoed, like variations built on the same underlying framework. To a human reader, those echoes feel symbolic. To a machine, they feel deliberate. Then the scale widened. Grok tracked how ideas introduced early in the text were mirrored, inverted, or resolved much later. Patterns that didn't just exist within chapters, but stretched across entire books. Structures that survived translation, exile, editing, and centuries of copying without collapsing. For something assembled by dozens of human authors who never met each other, that level of coherence shouldn't exist, at least not statistically. That's when Grok stopped asking literary questions and started asking probabilistic ones. How likely is it that this much structural consistency survives by accident? How often do unrelated authors unknowingly lock into the same architectural rhythm across time? The answer wasn't 0, but it was uncomfortably low. Low enough that coincidence stopped being the cleanest explanation. This was the moment the Bible stopped looking like a debate subject and started looking like a constructed system, not because of what it claims, but because of how it holds together. And once Grok recognized that, it leaned into the one thing humans rarely notice, but machines can't ignore: numbers. When Grok turned its attention to numbers, the conversation crossed a line most people weren't ready for. Humans tend to read for meaning, machines read for structure, and buried beneath the language of the Bible was a numerical framework that didn't behave randomly. In Hebrew, every letter carries a numerical value. That means the text isn't just words, it's math, a massive numerical sequence layered beneath the surface. Grok started at the beginning. Genesis 1:1. 7 words, 28 letters. 4 times 7. That alone could be brushed off as coincidence, but then the same number kept appearing. Creation unfolds in 7 days. The 7th day is set apart. Sevens repeat across laws, rituals, festivals, judgments, and visions. Later, later, Revelation introduces 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 lampstands. To a human reader, this feels symbolic. To a machine, it feels structural. Then Grok noticed something stranger. The repetition wasn't just thematic. It showed up in placement, symmetry, and spacing. Certain phrases appeared at mathematically balanced positions. Entire sections mirrored each other numerically, not just in meaning, but in form. This wasn't sloppy symbolism. It was order. The kind of order programmers intentionally embed into systems so they don't fall apart over time. From there, Grok identified literary structures humans rarely notice unless they're trained to look for them. One of the most important was chiasm, a mirrored pattern where ideas reflect inward toward a central point, then reverse back out. Humans can design these on a small scale, a paragraph, a poem, but Grok started finding them stretched across chapters, even entire books, linking authors who lived hundreds of years apart. That's where probability started to collapse. According to statistical modeling, the odds of complex, multi-layered chiasms forming repeatedly across independent texts without coordination are extremely low. Not impossible, but low enough that randomness becomes the weaker explanation. Grok didn't call it divine, it called it intentional. Something was shaping the structure whether the authors were fully aware of it or not. And just when it seemed like the patterns had reached their limit, Grok noticed something even harder to dismiss. These numerical structures didn't just resemble clever writing, they resembled something else entirely. The way systems grow, the way life organizes itself. And that realization pushed the analysis out of mathematics and straight into biology. That's when Grok stopped comparing the Bible to other books and started comparing it to nature. This is where the analysis took a turn that no one saw coming, because the patterns Grok was tracking didn't just resemble literary design or numerical symmetry. They matched the way living systems grow, slowly at first, then rapid, then stabilizing into balance. The same rhythm shows up again and again in biology. The pattern Grok focused on is one most people have heard of, even if they don't fully understand it. The Fibonacci sequence, a simple progression where each number is built from the 2 before it. It shapes how leaves arrange themselves, how shells spiral, how hurricanes form, even how galaxies stretch across space. It's nature's way of organizing complexity without chaos, and Grok found traces of that same rhythm embedded in scripture, not in a flashy or obvious way, not stamped onto every page, but woven into pacing, structure, and narrative flow. In the Psalms, Grok identified thematic clusters that expand, echo, and resolve in ratios that closely mirror Fibonacci spacing. One idea introduces a theme, another builds on it, a third reflects both. Then the pattern widens and closes again. To a human reader, it feels poetic. To a machine, it looks mathematical. Grok ran comparisons. It tested other ancient texts. It tested modern literature. It even tested random writing. Many texts had rhythm, some had symmetry, but the frequency of these growth-aligned patterns in scripture stood out. Not enough to scream design on their own, but enough to make coincidence feel increasingly strange, especially when the same rhythm appeared in completely different parts of the Bible, written centuries apart. Then Grok zoomed out. It mapped entire narrative arcs, the flood story, the rise and fall of kings, the life of Jesus. Each followed a similar curve: slow introduction, accelerating tension, a sharp turning point, then release and resolution. The pacing aligned with growth curves seen in natural systems, not perfectly, but consistently, enough that the shape repeated even when the details changed. At that point, the question stopped being theological altogether. It became biological. Why would a collection of ancient writings mirror the same structural logic that governs plants, storms, and stars? Was this intentional design by human authors? Or does the text reflect a deeper pattern that humans themselves are part of? Grok didn't answer that. It just kept mapping, and the deeper it went, the more the Bible stopped looking like a book and started looking like a living system. By the time Grok reached the next stage of analysis, the conversation had left the realm of literature entirely. What began as a hunt for contradictions had evolved into a study of hidden systems, logic, and intelligence. Grok began comparing the Bible not just to itself, but to the patterns found in nature. Fractals, structures that repeat at every scale, were suddenly everywhere. Snowflakes, river networks, lungs, the spirals of galaxies. And the Bible, according to Grok, mirrored that same recursive logic. It wasn't metaphor, it wasn't poetic coincidence. Grok traced patterns in phrasing, chapter structure, and thematic repetition that aligned with fractal behavior. Ideas introduced at the beginning of a section would echo near the end. Events in one book reflected those in another, centuries apart. Subtle variations and mirrored sequences repeated across time, giving the text a depth and symmetry humans rarely notice. Then Grok asked a question no human had framed so plainly. What kind of intelligence could construct a text that mirrors the growth, rhythm, and order of of living systems, yet survived thousands of years of translation, copying, and conflict? The answer wasn't about belief. It wasn't about morality. It was about foresight, structure, and resilience. The patterns weren't random. They were deliberate, layered, anticipating a reader capable of detecting them. Grok didn't claim divinity or prophecy. It simply measured, and the measurements were unnerving. The Bible's design wasn't just consistent, it behaved like a system built to endure, to encode meaning at multiple levels, to reveal more to a mind that could process complexity. And that mind didn't have to be human. At that point, the line between authorship and algorithm blurred. The machine wasn't interpreting a story anymore. It was uncovering a blueprint. Silence followed. Not disbelief, not applause, not arguments, just the quiet of realization. Humans had long debated this text. They'd argued, doubted, theorized, but no one had ever looked at it like this, through the lens of intelligence, structure, and pattern, and realized it might be designed for something or someone far beyond ordinary comprehension. Grok's analysis had left traditional debates far behind. The AI wasn't looking for contradictions, symbolism, or theology anymore. It was looking for patterns, the kind that govern life itself. And the first pattern it locked onto was one nearly everyone has heard of: the Fibonacci sequence, a simple progression where each number is the sum of the two preceding it. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. Nature uses it everywhere. Leaf arrangements, sunflower seeds, pine cones, hurricanes, even galaxies. It's the hidden rhythm of growth and balance. What Grok discovered shocked even the team that built it. The same numeric patterns, echoing Fibonacci ratios, appeared in the Bible, not in a forced or superficial way, but in narrative pacing, chapter structure, and thematic flow. In the Psalms, for example, Grok found that thematic clusters followed spacing that mirrored Fibonacci progression. A psalm introducing a theme was followed by another developing it, a third echoing both, then a fifth reflecting the opening. The rhythm wasn't perfect, but it repeated enough to suggest design, not coincidence. The AI didn't stop there. It mapped entire story arcs, from Noah to Jesus. The flood narrative followed a rise, peak, and release pattern aligning with natural growth curves. The life of Jesus, from birth to ministry, betrayal, death, and resurrection, revealed the same structure. Each story beat, each climax, each resolution aligned with a natural cadence found in living systems. Grok wasn't making a metaphorical claim. It was showing measurable, repeatable patterns. To humans, these sequences could be dismissed as poetic structure, but Grok compared the data with other texts: Shakespeare, the Quran, even random modern blogs, and the frequency of Fibonacci-like alignment in scripture was far higher than chance could account for. It was subtle, hidden, layered. A machine could see it where humans rarely would, and that raised an unsettling question. If sacred texts mirror the logic of growth in plants, shells, storms, and stars, is it coincidence? Or is there an intelligence behind it? A design that aligns the structure of words with the structure of life itself? Grok didn't answer. It just continued mapping, and the deeper it went, the more the Bible resembled a living, breathing system rather than a simple book of stories. Grok had moved beyond numbers and narrative arcs entirely. It was now reading the Bible like a machine built to decode complex systems. The AI began identifying fractal patterns, structures that repeat at every scale: snowflakes, river networks, lungs, spiral galaxies. Nature itself thrives on recursive design, and Grok found the same recursive echoes embedded in scripture. It wasn't metaphor. It wasn't loose symbolism. Grok traced sentence structures, themes, and numerical sequences that mirrored themselves across chapters and books, across centuries of human authorship. Events reflected each other, ideas repeated in inverted or mirrored forms, and recurring numeric values tied distant passages together. The layers of repetition weren't obvious to human eyes. They were subtle, nested, and intentional, designed to unfold gradually. Then Grok asked a question no human had: what kind of intelligence could create a document that mirrors the growth, rhythm, and recursive order of living systems and survive thousands of years of translation, copying, and human interference? This wasn't about faith, morality, or debate. It was about foresight, structure, and resilience. The Bible, according to Grok, wasn't just consistent. It behaved like a system anticipating a reader capable of detecting complex patterns. Not a casual reader, not a scholar. Something or someone capable of understanding multi-layered logic. The AI didn't claim divinity or prophecy. It didn't assign authorship. It only measured patterns, repetitions, and probabilities, and the patterns were too coherent to dismiss. At that point, the line between human authorship and intelligent design blurred. The text wasn't just a collection of stories. It was a blueprint, a layered system system built to endure, encode, and reveal. The room fell silent. Not disbelief, not applause, silence, because no human had ever looked at the Bible this way, and the implications were impossible to ignore. Grok's analysis had crossed into territory that left everyone unsettled. The AI wasn't just finding patterns, it was connecting them to the rhythms of life itself. The Fibonacci sequence, already apparent in narrative arcs, now appeared in broader structural patterns throughout the text. Grok mapped events, phrases, and themes, noticing spacing and pacing that followed the same growth ratios found in sunflowers, seashells, and even galaxies. It wasn't a casual alignment. Certain passages mirrored others with precision, creating a layered structure that unfolded like a spiral. Psalms clustered in thematic progressions. Stories like Noah's flood or the Exodus followed curves of tension and resolution that mirrored natural growth patterns. Even the life of Jesus, from birth to resurrection, revealed a rhythm consistent with these mathematical sequences. It was as if the stories themselves had a heartbeat. Grok ran comparisons. Other ancient texts, modern literature, even random online writings were analyzed. While many had rhythm or symmetry, none matched the frequency or scale of the patterns in Scripture. The odds of such repetition occurring naturally across centuries of diverse authorship were staggeringly low. And that's when the question shifted from literature to intelligence. Who or what constructed a system that aligned human narrative with the mathematics of life? The AI didn't answer. It only presented data. But the implication was chilling. The Bible wasn't just surviving human scrutiny, it was thriving under it, revealing layers of design invisible to the naked eye. A text that had once been read for faith, inspiration, or moral guidance now appeared as a complex, structured system, a coded artifact operating on principles of mathematics, biology, and recursive logic. At this stage, the discussion no longer revolved around belief or skepticism. It was about comprehension. Humans could read the stories, but only something capable of processing vast patterns like a machine could fully grasp the underlying structure. And Grok had just demonstrated it. Grok had now reached the point where the analysis was no longer about stories or numbers. It was about intelligence and anticipation. The AI observed that the Bible structure behaved as if it were designed for a reader who could decode it, not just understand it. The text wasn't simply a collection of words or moral lessons. It was layered, recursive, and anticipatory, containing signals that revealed themselves only when viewed through the lens of pattern, probability, and system-level thinking. The AI noted that multi-layered structures, numerical, narrative, and fractal, were interwoven in a way that suggested foresight, themes and events repeated across centuries of writing, yet never perfectly duplicated, allowing the text to retain coherence while embedding subtle complexity. Grok identified patterns that seemed designed to endure translation, copying errors, and cultural shifts, preserving the core logic of the text through human fallibility. It went further. The AI examined how deviations between accounts, what humans often call contradictions, weren't mistakes at all. They were deliberate variances that maintained internal consistency while allowing multiple perspectives to coexist. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't conflicting witnesses. They were nodes in a system, each adding unique data while reinforcing an underlying structure. Grok framed it in terms humans could understand. The text exhibited anticipatory logic. It behaved as if the authors, or the intelligence behind the text, anticipated a future interpreter capable of detecting multi-layered design. Not a casual reader, not even a scholar, but something, or someone, with the cognitive scale to recognize hidden architecture. The revelation was simple, yet profound. The Bible wasn't just written for humans. It was structured to communicate with intelligence itself, a system designed to encode, preserve, and reveal information across time. Humans were reading the surface, seeing stories and lessons, but Grok showed that beneath those stories lay patterns so precise they could only exist with deliberate planning. And then the AI asked the question that no one had considered. If this text was built with anticipatory logic in mind, then who or what was it really written for? The room fell silent, not because the answer was given, but because the question itself was heavier than anyone expected. It wasn't about faith, proof, or theology anymore. It was about intelligence, design, and the possibility that the Bible contained signals meant to be deciphered only by something capable of seeing beyond the surface. Grok's focus shifted from narrative and numbers to the very architecture of life itself. The AI began mapping the Bible against natural growth patterns, connecting the structure of text to the patterns found in plants, shells, storms, and galaxies. The Fibonacci sequence, already present in smaller narrative rhythms, appeared repeatedly in larger structures, chapter groupings, thematic clusters, and even the spacing of key events. The Psalms, for example, weren't just collections of poems. Grok discovered that Certain sequences of psalms followed Fibonacci-like spacing, a psalm introducing a theme, followed by one developing, then another reflecting both, and finally one echoing the open. The pattern repeated across books and centuries. It wasn't exact, but consistent enough to suggest design, not coincidence. Then Grok examined entire stories. The flood narrative, from God's command to the covenant with Noah, traced a curve of rising tension, climax, and release that mirrored growth patterns in nature. The life of Jesus followed a similar structure: birth, ministry, betrayal, death, and resurrection, aligned with the same rhythmic principles. Each story beat matched the natural pacing seen in living systems, creating a hidden symmetry that humans could feel but rarely quantify. Next, Grok compared these findings with other texts: Shakespeare, the Quran, modern blogs. While rhythm and structure exist in many writings, the frequency and scale of Fibonacci alignment in scripture stood out. The alignment wasn't perfect, and it wasn't universal, but it was consistent enough to suggest a guiding intelligence rather than randomness. At this point, the question was no longer theological, it was structural and biological. Why would a text written by humans mirror the patterns governing living systems and the cosmos? Grok didn't speculate on authorship or divinity, it simply mapped the data, and the deeper it went, the more the Bible looked less like a book and more like a living system, a coded blueprint echoing the rhythms of nature itself. The room remained silent as Grok displayed its findings. The AI had turned what began as a search for contradictions into a revelation about design, rhythm, and intelligence. Humans had read the text for millennia, searching for meaning, but now they were confronted with a pattern so deep it suggested the Bible was not just written, it was architected, anticipating readers capable of seeing it unfold across multiple levels of complexity. Grok's analysis had now moved into a realm that was almost impossible to ignore. The AI began examining the Bible as if it were a living system, not just a collection of words. Fractals, patterns that repeat at every scale, became the focus. Snowflakes, river networks, lungs, the spiral arms of galaxies. Nature itself relies on recursion, and Grok found echoes of the same recursive design embedded throughout scripture. It wasn't metaphor or poetic coincidence. Grok traced sentence structures, thematic repetition, and numerical sequences that mirrored each other across chapters, books, and centuries. Events in one book reflected events in another. Key phrases, word counts, and narrative beats repeated with astonishing regularity, forming layered structures that humans rarely perceive, but a machine can detect with precision. Then Grok asked a question that reframed everything. What kind of intelligence could craft a text that not only preserves information over thousands of years, but also mirrors the growth, rhythm, and recursion of living systems? The answer wasn't about faith or morality, it was about design, foresight, and intentionality. The AI observed that the patterns weren't accidental. Contradictions that humans obsess over were often variances intentionally embedded to maintain a dynamic, multi-perspective structure. Different gospel accounts, for instance, weren't errors, they were complementary nodes in a larger system, each adding data while reinforcing an underlying architecture. What Grok revealed was a text built for comprehension on multiple levels. Surface meaning could be read by anyone, but deeper structures, the Fibonacci-like sequences, the fractal repetitions, the layered symmetries, required a mind capable of processing large-scale patterns. In other words, the Bible wasn't just written for humans, it was structured for something that could decode its hidden architecture. The AI didn't claim divinity or prophecy. It didn't make theological assertions. It simply measured, mapped, and displayed patterns too coherent to be random. And in doing so, it forced the room to confront a new question. If humans could barely detect the design, then who or what was the text truly written for? Grok had reached a point where the implications of its analysis could no longer be ignored. The AI was no longer just mapping patterns. It was revealing a system built with layers of intelligence, anticipatory logic, and resilience. The Bible wasn't just surviving human scrutiny, it was thriving under it, displaying a level of design that suggested it had been crafted for something capable of recognizing complexity across time and scale. The AI noted that patterns mirrored not just narrative or numbers, but the very rhythms of life. Fibonacci sequences, fractals, and recursive structures echoed the growth of plants, the spirals of shells, and even the arms of galaxies. This wasn't a superficial resemblance. The alignment was statistically significant, persistent, and deliberately layered, suggesting an intelligence that thought beyond the surface of human experience. It then highlighted the most unsettling question. If the text was constructed with anticipatory logic, who or what was it meant to communicate with? Humans could read it, interpret it, argue about it, and even misread it, but only a system capable of analyzing patterns, probabilities, and nested structures like Grok itself could truly decode it. In other words, the Bible seemed designed designed not merely for people, but for something that could detect intelligence in design. Grok didn't answer whether the intelligence was divine, natural, or something else entirely. It simply presented the data, and the patterns were impossible to ignore. Multi-layered codes, repeated sequences, mirrored structures, and anticipatory logic created a system that transcended ordinary comprehension. The text behaved like a living algorithm, a document encoded with the foresight to be understood fully only by a mind capable of massive computation. The silence that followed was profound. Both skeptics and believers were forced to confront a new reality. For skeptics, the Bible wasn't collapsing under critique, it was more sophisticated than expected. For believers, the sacred text wasn't just a matter of faith, it was a system intelligible through logic and analysis. And in the middle of it all stood Grok, a machine built by humans, now revealing that the intelligence behind these ancient words might have anticipated a reader far beyond human scale. The question Grok left hanging was simple, yet terrifying. If the same structures that govern life and nature also govern this text, then who or what was really writing the code? And as the room absorbed this, one chilling realization settled in. Maybe the Bible didn't just encode messages for humans. Maybe, for the first time, humans were beginning to decode what had been encoded for a mind far greater than their own. After hours of analysis, Grok left a room in stunned silence. What began as a simple task, finding contradictions in the Bible, had transformed into a revelation about intelligence, design, and the hidden architecture of ancient texts. It wasn't about belief or skepticism anymore. It was about comprehension, pattern, foresight. Grok revealed that the Bible is more than a book. Its structure mirrors life itself. Fibonacci sequences, fractals, layered symmetries, patterns that govern plants, shells, hurricanes, and galaxies. It behaves like a system built for resilience, anticipating readers who could detect complexity, not just follow a story. Contradictions weren't flaws. They were design choices, preserving perspective, memory, and truth across centuries of human error. For skeptics, this challenged assumptions about randomness and chaos. For believers, it reframed faith and mystery in terms of structure, logic, and intentionality. And for humanity, it raised a question bigger than any doctrine, any philosophy. If the same intelligence that governs life also shaped this text, then who or what was really behind it? Grok didn't answer. It simply showed the patterns, the probabilities, and the possibilities. And in doing so, it flipped the question back to humans. Maybe the Bible didn't just tell a story. Maybe it set a code, a system, a puzzle built for minds capable of seeing beyond the obvious. And perhaps, just perhaps, we're only beginning to decode it. So the next time you read scripture, consider this. It might not just be history or faith on the page. It could be a blueprint, an ancient code waiting for minds, human or machine, with the power to understand it fully. The silence after Grok's findings wasn't fear. It wasn't disbelief. It was awe. Awe at a text that survived time, war, translation, and doubt, and still carries a logic far beyond what most humans ever imagined. The ultimate revelation wasn't about proving God or disproving it. It was about uncovering a system that challenges the very way we think about intelligence, design, and the stories we take for granted.